Cheryl Glass is a name that every motorsport fan should have known. For years, anytime she showed up to a racetrack, she was the first Black woman to have competed at that track and at that event. She carved a path of broken records through the Washington state area before spreading her wings to take on challenges all across America. She should have been a star. And she was for a time. But that star power fizzled as the pressure of rapid progress and instant success wore Cheryl Glass down. Glass never really had time to learn the ropes in any one series or with any one car before she forced herself to move up the ranks. She wanted to be the first Black woman to race in the Indy 500, and she wanted to do it as quickly as possible. Instead, her star power fizzled out. Her chances to race became fewer and farther between. She got married and divorced. She tried new cars and failed. She reported that her home was burglarized and that she was raped. On July 15th, 1997, Cheryl Glass's body was found beneath the Aurora Bridge in Seattle. The cause of death was ruled a suicide. But what really happened to Cheryl Glass? How did the career of this promising star fall apart? What went wrong? Did she even commit suicide? These are questions that many motorsport fans are still reckoning with today, and questions that I'll attempt to answer in this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Motorsport isn't just about fast cars and daredevil drivers. It's a place where scandals burn hotter than exhaust pipes. This is a history podcast dedicated to delving into the darkest corners of the racing world to uncover secrets, deception, and intrigue. My name is Elizabeth Blackstock, and welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Cheryl Lynn Glass was born on Christmas Eve in 1961. Her parents, Marvin and Shirley, had both grown up in a Great Depression-racked rural Tennessee, where segregation ran rampant and where Black folks struggled to climb out of institutional poverty. Cheryl's maternal grandmother was sent to prison for killing her abusive lover. Her paternal grandparents, as well as her father, picked cotton to make a living. But both of Cheryl's parents understood that they were destined for bigger and better things, seeing education as a way to improve their station in life. They met in Nashville, where they were both studying engineering at the Tennessee Agricultural and Industrial State College, one of the few all-Black colleges in the United States. Before even graduating, both Shirley and Marvin had accepted lucrative jobs with Boeing that would require them to move from Tennessee to Washington State. The day after they received their diplomas, the two were married, and the wedding reception doubled as a going-away party for the couple before they jetted off across the country the following day. The West Coast had slowly become a hub for engineering-minded Black folks thanks to Boeing. The plane manufacturer first established itself in 1916 and became a massive powerhouse after it landed lucrative government contracts during World War II and the Korean War. To justify those contracts, though, the government required companies like Boeing to hire a certain percentage of Black people in engineering or research roles. Marvin and Shirley Glass agreed to take 2 of those roles. Then, when Boeing's government contracts were fulfilled, Marvin and Shirley moved to California to work with Lockheed in 1960. That following year, on Christmas Eve, Shirley Glass gave birth to her and Marvin's first child, a bright young girl they named Cheryl Lynn. When their little girl was still a toddler, Shirley was offered a job with the Navy, and the family moved back to Seattle. Marvin reunited with Boeing before swapping to Pacific Northwest Bell, where he became the vice president of planning and operations. Shirley, meanwhile, left the Navy and went back to Boeing. Thanks to their engineering skills and comfortable jobs, the Glass family was able to raise Cheryl with a kind of wealth that would have seemed impossible in their own childhoods. Their young daughter was bright, and they were able to dote on her and give her an exceptional education at a series of private schools for gifted children, and to raise her in a series of increasingly comfortable homes. On top of that, the Glasses were very big players in the local community, which meant Cheryl grew up with a large net of well-to-do families just like her parents. It was thanks to a community-wide fundraiser that Cheryl found her first passion, art. In order to raise money for a swimming pool, Marvin Glass asked his wife and daughter to bake and decorate cookies, which they could then sell to help fund the pool. A young Cheryl fell in love with the art of cookie decorating and began to dream of ways to channel that into a career. When she was 7, she expressed an interest in making and decorating ceramics, and her family quickly filled their garage with kilns and tools. She took her first modeling class and soon found work in newspaper advertisements and department stores. Then she realized that she could sell her ceramics to the department stores she'd already been working with, and at age 11, her mother would drop her off at the shops and let a preteen Cheryl work her magic with a sales pitch. By the same afternoon, Cheryl would have landed several deals. Cheryl was the kind of kid that cycled through a diverse array of hobbies, including ice skating, gymnastics, ballet, volleyball, and soccer. According to Bill Poehler, who wrote The First Lady of Dirt, a book about Glass, Cheryl did not do anything by half measures. If she took on an interest, she would dedicate her every spare moment to it until she was ready to move on to something else, which usually happened when she realized she wasn't the best at that particular skill. She was always quite good at whatever new challenge she took on, but good was never good enough. There has to be something out there at which I can be the best. It's just up to me to find out what that something is, Cheryl said in an interview. A newspaper brought Cheryl wind of her next big adventure. In 1970, when she was 10 years old, she read an article about something called quarter midgets. These cars were 1/4 the size of a full midget car, which was built for adults. The quarter midgets were built for children and were raced on much shorter tracks. It was a form of racing that was more readily found in the South, where NASCAR racing traced its roots. It was kind of unheard of up in Seattle, and that's part of what appealed so much to Glass. She liked the idea of bringing home trophies. She liked the idea of competing in something with a much smaller field of interested athletes compared to the other sports that she had tried. Cheryl had earned about $300 selling her ceramics, and in today's currency, that's something around $2,300. Because she dipped a toe in so many various activities but failed to stick around, her family wanted Cheryl to pay for her own race machine, but they were more than willing to offer support and guidance wherever they could. To say that the Glass family had no idea what to expect would probably be an understatement. When Cheryl got behind the wheel of her quarter midget for the first time at Painfield, she had never driven the car before, and she'd never even been to a race to see what it was like. Still, motorsport seemed to come naturally to her, and she took 3rd place in her debut event. At the end of the 1971 season, her competitors and the Washington Quarter Midget Association voted her Rookie of the Year. Her family also grew more involved. When Shirley discovered she was pregnant with her second child, she and Marvin purchased a bigger house, one with a large 2-car garage that could become Cheryl's dedicated motorsport workspace. Her family agreed to purchase more supplies for her, and before long, they'd established something as close to a state-of-the-art shop as you could get while still being very green at a sport. Cheryl's successes started to come thick and fast. She won the novice class main event at the 1972 Northwest State Championship at Painfield, then began to travel to new tracks in the Pacific Northwest. She went to her first Grand Nationals event in 1973, where she made the semi-main event in the heavy B-modified class. By then, her entire family was involved. Marvin, Cheryl's father, was her manager, and he sought out qualified mechanics to help develop his daughter's cars. Shirley, her mother, painstakingly crafted immaculate race suits for Cheryl and outfits for the pit crews, something that regularly earned the Glass family the Best Dressed award at the track. In the meantime, Cheryl was still dabbling in other sports, like swimming and volleyball. She took advanced modeling classes and appeared in national magazines like 17. She started crafting intricate porcelain dolls that took 3 months to make, but that could net her hundreds of dollars once they sold. She advanced up the racing ranks, visiting new tracks and becoming the first Black woman to race at many of them. She was a hit with papers and local news channels who just couldn't get enough of her interviews, and by the time she was 17, Cheryl looked like she was on the fast track to becoming one of racing's biggest celebrities. In retrospect, there was a problem, though. Cheryl was never afraid of pushing herself beyond her limits to figure out just how far she could go, but that meant she was prone to crashing. A lot. She received a rollover award for being the driver to flip the most times when she was still a preteen. And even though she wasn't too badly hurt as a kid, she was involved in a lot of frankly concerning amounts of jarring wrecks. Cheryl would bounce back quickly each time, desperate to get behind the wheel as soon as she could. In 1978, Cheryl graduated high school early, at age 16, and enrolled in the University of Washington with the intention of pursuing an electrical engineering degree. Meanwhile, she decided to move up from quarter midget to full-size midgets, with the hope of one day building up the skill set necessary to run the Indianapolis 500. She had just one outing at Olympia Tenino, a quarter-mile asphalt oval, before she decided the discipline was not for her. Her midget was pushed to start, but as soon as she entered the track for practice, another driver hit her and wrecked the car. She turned her attention to sprint car racing instead, a more challenging discipline, but one she thought she could master. Moving up to sprint cars required a massive shift for both Cheryl and her family. She dropped out of college and stepped back from the disco dancing competition she had been entering and winning. Her family stepped up to foot the bill for the much more expensive cars that Cheryl's ceramics and porcelain dolls could not match. Her family sourced a vehicle from one of the most impressive sprint car builders of the era, Jerry Day, and after she finally turned 18, Cheryl decided to enter a season of events at Skagit Speedway for 1980, which was about an hour away from the Glass family home in Seattle. It was a leap far outside Cheryl's comfort zone, but those leaps were common for her. Cheryl had never been to Skagit before she arrived there for her first race, but that didn't deter her because that had been the story of her career. Neither did her lack of sprint car experience or her lack of experience with that kind of track deter her. On opening day of the 1980 season, she took home a 13th place finish. The track owners offered her practice time, knowing that the better Cheryl did, the more attention she would get, and the more fans would attend the races. Unfortunately, in her second race of 1980, she crashed and tore ligaments in both of her knees. She only missed one May race before she forced herself back in the car, but it took a while for her to get back in the swing of things. By July, though, she was finishing in the top 5 in Skagit Speedway events. And then she received a concussion after another nasty crash, but was back racing again after a week-long stay in the hospital, only for her to crash as soon as she got back to the track. Then came the final race of the Skagit season on August 30th, 1980. Cheryl had had her car looked over by its builder, Jerry Day, just before the race was delayed for hours due to rain. When she finally got on track, she was quick in practice and was set to start third in the main event. On the 7th of 35 laps, she passed the second-place driver. 3 laps later, the engine in the leader's car blew up, and Cheryl inherited the lead, a lead that she was forced to fight hard to maintain. Nevertheless, she held it until the checkered flag. Cheryl Glass had won her first sprint car main event. It seemed like things could only go uphill from there. The Indianapolis 500 is kicking off next month, and if you're looking to gear up for the greatest spectacle in racing with some of the finest fits around, look no further than Homefield Apparel. Homefield is based in Speedway, Indiana, right in the backyard of the Brickyard. This is a clothing company that knows exactly what fans want from their merch, and Homefield provides time and time again. With comfortable shirts and kick-ass jackets and vintage-style hats making up Homefield's debut in the motorsport world, you can easily build your ideal race day outfit all in one spot. To start stocking up on your Indy 500 race day gear, make sure you check out Homefield Apparel, and if it's your first time buying, don't forget to use the code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. After capping off her first full-time sprint car season with a win, Cheryl Glass was desperate to maintain the momentum she felt was pushing her career forward. Washington's incessant rain meant that its racing season inevitably ended in August, but there were still events being held down in California, and Cheryl decided that's where she'd go. A Californian named Duke McMillan offered Cheryl some space in his workshop if she decided to race down south, and she took him up on his offer. She laid out a very ambitious racing schedule, and her mechanic, Jim Grantham, even made the commitment to help Cheryl out by leaving his family and moving to Sacramento for a few months just to work on her car. But Cheryl decided she didn't want to live in California. Instead, she thought she would fly from Washington to California each weekend, then fly from California to Washington after her race was done. Her first California outing was the Gold Cup. This multi-day racing event attracted the best sprint car talent from around the country, and Glass was, at the time, one of the most prominent names. She was the 18-year-old black girl, the first of her kind to compete at the event, and the sprint car driver who defied the odds and could call herself a race winner. Why not try her hand against icons like Sammy Swindell and Steve Kinzer? Women aren't supposed to be sprint car drivers, and most men back in the Northwest haven't really liked me, Cheryl said in an interview with the Indianapolis Star. Their attitudes have made it very difficult for me to race, but I've been accepted around professional drivers. I was brought up to be very open-minded, and I never looked at it as I was black and couldn't do it. I'm determined to prove I can handle it. On her first night of racing, she finished 6th after starting in 20th position in the B main event. In the big sprint car events like the Gold Cup, entries are split into smaller groups denoted by letters of the alphabet. If you finish in the top 4 positions in one of those races, you can move up to the next event, where you would take on more challenging competition and try to finish higher to make it to the main event. Cheryl was just 2 positions outside of the transfer zone with her 6th place finish, but her impressive skill passing 13 cars was on full display, making her a hit nonetheless. She then moved on to race in the Golden State Challenge, a series of 4 races held over 2 weekends. She didn't quite get close to winning, but she was always one of the top competitors. On October 19th, she took on an even newer challenge. Thunder Park Speedway was a half-mile dirt oval track located in Sacramento, and it was bigger than anything Glass had ever raced before. Rather than take the time to learn the nuances of the track, she assumed she could take that first corner flat out. And during qualifying, she launched into the air, but still set the 6th fastest time of the night. She took home 10th in the main event. Then it all fell apart. Glass was invited to compete at Manzanita Raceway in Phoenix, Arizona. The half-mile dirt oval had a tendency to slick up, making it a challenge in and of itself. But there was another catch. The event Cheryl would compete in, the Western World Championships, only allowed wingless sprint cars. She had no experience with one, meaning she'd be learning a whole new kind of car control at a brand new track. But Glass would be up against the best drivers in the world, and she wanted to show that she deserved her place. On the final night of racing, Cheryl slid too far up into the first turn. Her car slammed into the wall, then flipped 13 times. At the hospital, it took doctors hours to discover her injuries, Bill Poehler writes in The First Lady of Dirt. Eventually, they determined that she had hurt her face, neck, right shoulder, back, both hips, both knees, and one ankle. The blood vessels in her eyes had burst, leaving her unable to see for several hours. She remained in the hospital for a week before she was finally released, but her racing that year was done. Glass's injuries alone would have prevented her from competing in the multitude of events that she'd scheduled through most of November, but her car was also a complete loss. Still, she told the Los Angeles Times, "Once I realized I was still alive after all the bouncing around, I never doubted I would race again." The Glass family instead began preparing for 1981. They bought new engines and a new chassis, dumping tens of thousands of dollars into a career that had, to this point, only netted Cheryl Glass a sum total of about $5,000. Ignoring her injuries, she took part in a road racing course at the Bob Bondurant School of High Performance and focused on rebuilding her strength. She received job offers from Speedy Bill Smith, a car owner that also ran a chain of performance parts stores. He offered her use of a $100,000 sprint car, plus 30% of the prize money she earned, and $40,000 if she won a race. She also got a cut of the sponsorship dollars and appearance fees on top of a monthly salary. All she had to do was run the full World of Outlaws schedule in 1981, and she would establish herself as a professional driver. When I started racing, some of my fellow drivers didn't particularly like the idea, Glass told the Tampa Tribune that year. They tried to crowd me out, push me around, but that didn't last too long. They pushed me around until they found out I'd push back. The situation with the team seemed incredibly promising, but Glass's first performance did not live up to the hype that the media was heaping on the 19-year-old driver. At her first race, she failed to qualify for the main event. At the next weekend, she spun while completing her hot laps, and another competitor crashed into the front of her car. Cheryl Glass pulled into the pits, and she quit on the spot. It's not completely clear what happened. In his biography on Glass, Bill Poehler says that correspondence showed she was used to an attentive, family-run team, whereas the singular mechanic on Smith's team had mostly ignored her, instead focusing on getting the car of the team's other driver in running condition. It's also very likely that she was still feeling the impact of her injuries at Manzanita. In March of 1981, Cheryl Glass flew home to Seattle. There, she took up cheerleading and tested a hydroplane boat. She picked up a sponsorship for her sprint car and returned to the local Pacific Northwest scene with a brand new enclosed trailer, the first of its kind anyone at local tracks had seen. She was able to net some decent results, but the biggest problem was that she just kept crashing. Her family was spending the money to buy replacement parts, but it wouldn't be long before Cheryl attempted once again to push herself beyond her means on the track. Any positives from her year were wiped out by her tendency to wipe out, and the media that had once treated her as its darling now made her seem like a fool. Despite that, by 1982, Glass was claiming that she had received offers from several Indy 500 teams that she'd ultimately rejected because, as she said, "When I compete at Indianapolis, I want everything to be just right. I want the right car, the right crew, the right sponsor, everything. Everything wasn't right for this year. I don't want to be an also-ran when I get to Indy. I want to finish at the top." It was a very bold claim for someone who had barely even competed on asphalt ovals. She got that chance, though, in 1982, courtesy of an engine builder who occasionally entered sprint cars and races. Jack Connor asked Glass if she would like to compete at the Copper World Classic, a sprint car event hosted at the mile-long Phoenix International Raceway. The car was not very good, though, and Cheryl bumped wheels with a competitor, hit the guardrail, and drifted down the track, wiping out the race leader Ken Hamilton. This is a point in Glass's life where we start to see a change in her personality. Jack Connor said she was difficult to work with, that she had a lack of humility. She often accused her competitors of racing her hard with the intention of wrecking her. But she found yet another shot in 1982, this time with car builder Charlie Patterson. He believed Glass's presence on his team would help him secure sponsorship. She, meanwhile, would gain experience in a handful of USAC races. The proposed sponsorship dollars never came, despite Patterson working hard to solicit goodwill from the Indianapolis chapter of the NAACP, an organization that strives for equality between races. He tried calling a press conference to announce her as his driver, but that turned up nothing. Patterson even wrote over 200 letters to black actors, hoping someone would help, and no one did. In Poehler's biography, he reports that at this time, many people who met Cheryl just didn't like her. Some folks said she wasn't particularly outgoing, while Tom Binford, chief steward of the Indy 500, asked Charlie Patterson, "How do you put up with her attitude?" That was because Cheryl was so terse with him during their first meeting that he didn't think he could ever talk to her again. Her biggest problem was her attitude, Patterson reflected later in Road and Track. She seemed to be down on herself and down about everything. She was not a very joyous person at all. She was out of her element, and her attitude was partly because I don't think she realized how big a step this was until she made the step. I think her attitude hindered her more than her lack of experience. Without money, Glass flew home for a while, returning to Indiana a month later to complete the Hoosier 100 at the Indianapolis State Fairgrounds. It was the only race that Patterson could afford to enter Cheryl in, and that was only because the track was close to his home. Glass qualified on pole for her qualifying heat, but race officials told her that being a rookie, she'd have to start from the back of the field. She was convinced that the decision had to do with the color of her skin, and it rankled. 9 laps into the heat, Cheryl pulled into the pits and said the car wasn't running well. She would not race it again. She climbed out of the car and walked away. Later, she explained what had happened from her perspective, saying, "I parked it. The car wasn't set up to race. I just had a problem with the crew setting it up in a way that I wanted it. I had every problem, pushing, the rear end coming around, biting. I came prepared to race, and I'm not sure the crew did. The crew, because I'm a girl, doesn't think I know what I'm talking about. I'm a racer. I'm a front runner, not a back marker." Legendary American motorsport journalist Robin Miller witnessed that race and wrote, "You don't throw someone into a sprint car on a mile track when all they've ever done is little quarter and half milers. That's insane. I thought it was unfair to the kid." Still, Charlie Patterson was proud, telling Road and Track it gained a lot of national notoriety. It was the first time a girl did that well in a Silver Crown car. And she was a black girl, too, which added a lot of charisma to it. We conquered some space there that no one had ventured. Glass felt that going back home and once again racing on the Pacific Northwest Circuit would be an admission that her national aspirations had failed. Instead, she entered the Knoxville Nationals, the biggest sprint car race in the world. She was the first woman to ever compete there. In the build-up to the event, she attempted a World of Outlaws race at Eldora Speedway, but crashed. At Knoxville, she represented Washington in an exhibition race for the best driver from every state, but her path to the top ended when she placed 21st in the C-Main. Midgets, sprints, dirt cars, this is where you went to make your name, and it was a melting pot of talent, Robin Miller said, reflecting on Glass in 2017. There were a lot of really talented drivers like her who came from the West Coast to take on the best and found it was a whole different world. There were a lot of drivers like her that packed it up, went home, and never came back. That race at Knoxville would be one of the final races of her career. With no motorsport to occupy her busy mind, Cheryl Glass focused on her next big thing. Her wedding. Glass had met a 25-year-old mechanic named Richard Lindwall, and the two fell in love. He proposed to 20-year-old Glass a few months after they met, and she decided that she wanted her wedding to be the event of 1983 in Seattle high society. Cheryl designed and helped sew her own dress, a stunning garment made of satin, antique lace, thousands of hand-sewn pearls, crystals, and sequins, plus a 15-foot-long train and a shoulder-length veil. The dress, which weighed 40 pounds and took 1,000 hours to complete when all was said and done, was initially appraised at $18,000 and later reappraised at a whopping $105,000. It was a stunning dress for a stunning wedding, the reception of which would take place in an opulent ballroom at the newly built Sheraton Hotel. The Glass family spent upwards of $50,000 making Cheryl's greatest wedding dreams come true, and it was breathlessly reported on in local papers. The day of the wedding, people just showed up outside the church and the hotel, hoping that they could catch a glimpse. Cheryl and her new husband Richard bought a house, and she followed him to races in the hope of convincing someone to give her a ride. She attended racing schools and made up promotional brochures, trying to sell herself to sponsors. Her family bought her an old IndyCar chassis and set up time for her to test it. But at the time, actually outfitting an IndyCar chassis with an engine was expensive and required a complex lease deal with an engine provider. So when the Glasses invited media out to Seattle International Raceway to watch Cheryl test her car for the first time, they instead received a ridiculous photograph session that saw a truck pull Cheryl's IndyCar with a rope. She'd let go of the rope, and the photographers would take photos as if she was actually driving. The reality of the situation was that there was simply no engine in the engine bay. Nothing was sticking. She tried hydroplane racing and drag racing. She tried testing a Formula 2 car in the Can-Am series, paying for the machine with her family's money. When she felt confident that she could race that car, she proceeded to select the most difficult track for her debut, the Can-Am support race ahead of the 1984 Formula 1 Dallas Grand Prix. The street circuit there was poorly constructed, and her first go at navigating its tight twists and turns came in infernal heat. She crashed in qualifying, then tried racing in the backup car of her team. She finished 6 laps, then retired from the race. Her failure to make it to the big time meant Cheryl Glass's parents had officially run out of money. In order to continue funding her career, they'd take out hefty loans. Her husband, Richard Lindwall, filed for divorce. Soon after, she received a sponsorship offer from Coors, as the beer company had been criticized after Bill Coors levied some horrifying insults against Black people. She was offered $5,000 per year as a personal services retainer, plus appearance fees as high as $3,000 for things like talks and presentations. Coors also agreed to be an associate sponsor for her in the kart series, offering $40,000 to make it happen. Glass would simply have to find the remaining $60,000 or so to get behind the wheel. As she hunted for the money, Cheryl decided to open a new business. After her own wedding dress had been such a hit, other women had reached out to Cheryl hoping she'd design their dresses. She took orders using friends and family to sew the dresses. She bought a fantastic location at the Pioneer Square in downtown Seattle, and her acclaimed outfits sold for anywhere as high as $25,000. But as part of her Coors deal, Glass agreed to race a Toyota truck in Mickey Thompson's Stadium Series, an event kind of similar to today's Monster Jam that transformed baseball and football fields into dirt tracks that would host wild events with off-road trucks and other vehicles. It had been over a year since Glass had raced, but she was confident that she could immediately master this new form of motorsport. On her first practice lap with a passenger in the car, she tried launching from a tall, sharp jump that had been built into the track. But she had no idea what she was doing. She didn't know that when she hit that jump, she was supposed to punch the gas. Instead, she hit the brakes, and her truck landed nose first into the second jump on the course. She was removed from the car with the jaws of life because track workers were afraid she was paralyzed. Word spread instead that it was actually her passenger, possibly a mechanic or a radio star named Jim Bieroff, who was actually paralyzed. Glass had hit the steering wheel so hard that it folded, and she cracked her head and chest against the steering column. In the hospital, Cheryl Glass was diagnosed with a broken ankle and a handful of other physical ailments, but something else had happened, something worse. After that crash, she began to be plagued by head-splitting migraines so frequent and so intense that her doctors barred her from racing in kart. Instead of competing, she traveled the country making personal appearances at rallies and schools where she told audiences that she never knew she wasn't supposed to succeed, and that's exactly why she did. She racked up awards and made connections in the right places, but nothing ever really worked to transform themselves into a ride, and she lost her Coors contract in 1987. Cheryl hired a marketing company to attempt to find her sponsorships, an endeavor that failed. Her wedding dress business racked up complaints of delayed, shoddy work. She dated a man who abused her, promising he'd hire a hitman to kill her if she testified against him in court. She applied for racing licenses, even though she still suffered from those debilitating headaches. Other stranger and seemingly minor problems also came to light. Cheryl insisted on parking directly in front of her wedding dress business, which netted dozens of unpaid parking tickets. Her race team was sued for non-payment, and she was taken to small claims court. She started dating another man, Mike Oprecht, who almost immediately moved into her house. 6 months later, they got married in a small ceremony. It was only then that Glass revealed to him her headaches, and Oprecht soon found himself shuttling her to the hospital 4 or 5 times a week. She rotated between several different hospitals, hoping that would enable her to receive medication. By 1990, she was allegedly on 3 opiates, an antipsychotic medication, and a high blood pressure medication. She began threatening suicide. Anytime something went wrong, she decided she would try to sue the person involved. Oprecht filed for divorce soon after. But Cheryl Glass still held on to her dream of racing, and in 1990 she was offered a ride in the American Racing Series, a junior series to IndyCar in the same vein of modern Indy Next or Indy Lights. Her father, Marvin Glass, bought her a car and sent her to racing school, racking up $156,000 in spending just to get Cheryl behind the wheel for the final 2 races of 1990. But just before her first race, her mechanic Hersey Mallory asked Cheryl to let a faster driver by her at the start because he knew that driver wasn't afraid to hit Cheryl, and he wanted her to gain valuable experience turning laps on the track. Glass took it as a slight against her racing, and it soured their relationship, even though she finished 7th in the 11-car field at Nazareth. In practice for the finale at Laguna Seca, Glass crashed and destroyed the front end of her car. There was no way to fix it before the race, so she never started. Willie T. Ribbs, who ultimately became the first black man to test a Formula One car and then compete in the Indy 500, approached Cheryl at that race. He hoped to offer her advice. I was leaving at the end of the day, and me and my publicist were riding out of the paddock when I saw her standing out by her tent, stopped the car, got out, and introduced myself, Ribbs said later. She said she was trying to learn how to drive road courses, and I told her whatever help she needed to let me know. That was it. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes. She didn't have much to say. That's the first time I met her and the last time I saw her. Reflecting on Glass later, Ribbs added, "There's more chances of a black woman being an astronaut than being in a race car. I knew who she was before I met her, knew she'd run sprint cars, and knew there'd been none like her before, and there's been none since. A black woman will be president of the United States before another Cheryl Glass comes along." Still, Cheryl believed she had a chance at the entire 1991 season. At the year opener in Long Beach, she qualified 18th out of 18 cars and made plenty of enemies when she decided against attending any of the mandatory drivers' meetings. She failed to finish the race due to an electrical problem, but her competitors complained to officials that her performance on track was abysmal. The officials decided they'd give her another shot at the next race at Phoenix International Raceway, which would be more aligned with Glass's skill set. But Cheryl found out about the complaints, and she was enraged. In retaliation, she began to claim that motorsport was hiding a massive drug smuggling scandal operation, akin to that of Randy Lanier, John Paul Jr. and Sr., and the Whittington brothers. She took it a step further and alleged that the drug dealing was sanctioned by the government's Drug Enforcement Administration. In her fury, she wrote an article about that very subject, but no one would dare to publish it. In practice for Phoenix, Cheryl crashed and hit her head so hard that her helmet cracked. She had to borrow money for a new helmet. In the race, by lap 30 of 75, she was 3 laps down and crashed so spectacularly that several drivers had to avoid her. CART revoked her competition license. Cheryl claimed it was because she had threatened to expose their drug running operation, and she scheduled a protest at the Detroit Grand Prix. CART didn't want that bad press, so it mailed her license back to her. But without a car or a team willing to field her, Cheryl Glass's racing career was over. Between late 1991 and her death in 1997, Cheryl Glass's life began to disintegrate, and it's possible that one particular event launched her into that downward spiral. Cheryl Glass still lived in the home that she had bought after marrying Richard Lidwall, though by then she had transferred the title into her parents' name. Without motorsport to occupy her mind, Glass dedicated herself to transforming her home inside and out. She became an avid gardener and hired contractors to renovate the house's interior in order to transform it into her dream home. In late July of 1991, one particular contractor began upgrading her kitchen. But while they were there, Glass grew paranoid. She felt that the contractor wasn't making progress very quickly, and the laborers sent by that contractor repeatedly set off her home alarm as they arrived and left at very strange hours. She was so frustrated about having to return home to disarm and reset the alarm system that she just turned it off completely. On August 5th, 1991, Cheryl Glass called the police. Someone had removed temporary plasterboard from the bathroom window and entered her home. Cheryl Glass was robbed. Her possessions were damaged. Someone used her lipstick to scrawl Weissmacht, German for white power, on her living room wall. When police arrived, Glass showed them the damage and said she'd slept through a break-in that even included the thieves stealing from her bedside table. "I'd rather have someone burn a cross in my front yard than have them come into my home," Glass said, as reported by the Seattle Post. After the break-in, the contractor Cheryl had hired completed her kitchen renovations quickly, cleaned up its mess, and left. Several months later, Glass went to the police station to share more details about the burglary. She alleged that she saw 3 men involved, all of whom were skinheads. She said that 2 of the men had actually raped her. It was too late to complete a rape kit, but police asked Glass instead to undergo a psychiatric evaluation. She declined. That request infuriated Glass. She stopped trusting the police, but she still was trying to convince them the truth of her statements, even as she voiced concerns about a conspiracy against her. It was around this time that a man named Skip Young moved into her home. Young was a family friend whose father had worked with Marvin Glass at Boeing. Skip once raced hydroplanes, but had left the racing world behind to take on a series of odd jobs. At Cheryl's house, he took on outdoor projects, much to the annoyance of their primarily white neighbors. On February 2nd, 1992, Cheryl Glass attempted suicide by overdose. She grew reclusive and watched from a distance as Willie T. Ribbs became the first black driver in the Indy 500, and as Lynn St. James became the second woman to do so, securing Rookie of the Year honors in the process. Her father sold her racing trailer, and she began purging herself of her trophies. Exactly 1 year after the break-in, Cheryl Glass had hired the same set of contractors she'd employed on her kitchen, though this time they were brought in to provide a quote on a bathroom remodel. As the contractor and laborers entered her home, Cheryl said she recognized her rapist among them. Police looked into the matter but dismissed it after the man passed a polygraph test. When Cheryl learned that he was the roommate and nephew of a Washington state trooper and that he had ties to several white supremacy groups, she started to wonder if there was a much bigger conspiracy against her than she had previously thought. Clients of her wedding dress business began to sue Cheryl. Rather than fight it, she simply failed to show up in court. She tried to commit suicide again, and in the aftermath, a psychiatrist diagnosed her with multiple personality disorder. Police used that diagnosis as a justification for dismissing any further complaints she brought to them. Then Glass and Young began to become involved in neighborhood-wide fights that quickly turned vicious. Between 1986 and 1994, Bill Poehler, author of Glass's biography, says police responded to 84 calls that involved Cheryl Glass. She would call the police to report that her neighbors had thrown racial epithets at her and Young. Neighbors would call to report that Glass's yard was a mess, that she was illegally using their driveways instead of her own. Glass finally started seeing a psychiatrist named Stuart Bramhall, who became one of the few people to really listen to her at that time in her life. Her life was such that because of her injuries from the past racing accidents she had, she didn't really have control of her life, Bramhall said. However, if you check Dr. Bramhall's social media feeds today, you'll notice that she shares a dizzying array of articles about everything from the danger of vaccines to anti-transgender sentiment to theories about the secret CIA murders. Her prescribed medications thankfully worked for Cheryl, whose migraine slowed. But Dr. Bramhall also encouraged Cheryl and Skip Young to breathlessly record every instance of any slight against them by neighbors or police. Records at that time show a heated battle between Glass and her next-door neighbor regarding property lines. Cheryl used a gravel driveway that she claimed was on her property. Her neighbors asked her not to do that because they claimed it was on their property. Anytime the neighbors attempted to bring out surveyors, Glass and Young would yell at them until they left. At one point, Glass was handcuffed and placed in a police cruiser after a surveyor alleged that Glass had hit him with their lawn chair. Cheryl Glass alleged that the officers intentionally harmed her wrists, ankles, and esophagus while she was in the back of the cop car, and that resulted in her needing to use a wheelchair for the following 6 months. An FBI investigation found that her accusations had no basis. She received some money when her wedding dress business served as a location for a film, but the harassment at her home continued. More FBI investigations sided with the police force over Cheryl Glass, who was arrested 13 times and charged with 8 misdemeanors and 1 felony in the span of just 3 years. When the county announced it would finally drop its charges against her, Glass decided she had found the inspiration she needed to get back behind the wheel of a race car, but nothing ever came of it. She continued being sued by her clients. Her parents divorced. When one day she climbed into her van and found the fuel lines had been slashed, Cheryl Glass finally decided to move out of her neighborhood and into a small apartment with her father. She found some meaning by joining causes like Mothers Against Police Harassment and speaking in support of developing museums dedicated to Black history. But her paranoia continued. Her psychiatrist introduced Cheryl to a student of hers specializing in conspiracy theories, and that student encouraged Glass to continue speaking out about her beliefs that motorsport was involved in a massive drug scandal. She started dating the leader of a local Communist Party chapter, and the relationship turned sour. On July 15th, 1997, Cheryl Glass called off her appointment with her hairstylist, then spoke to both her father and her younger sister Sherry on the phone. She left the apartment she shared with her father to walk across the Aurora Bridge at around 4 p.m. Somehow, Cheryl Glass's body ended up in the river that afternoon. At 4:41 p.m., a harbor patrol boat was dispatched and quickly retrieved her body. She was declared dead 13 minutes later, but the impact likely killed her instantly. There is no agreement about Glass's cause of death. Medical examiners declared it was a case of suicide by drowning, and also noted the sheer number of scars patterning her body and the elevated levels of sedatives in her system. Glass's family and friends, though, were not convinced. Cheryl was ill, and it should have been impossible for her to haul herself over the railing of the Aurora Bridge. They found inconsistencies in the clothes Cheryl was wearing at her death and wondered what really happened with the briefcase that Cheryl had carried out of the apartment on the day of her death. Police had initially stated it was found on the opposite side of the bridge where Cheryl had allegedly jumped, but other people soon said it was found on the doorstep to Cheryl's apartment. A man wrote Shirley Glass a letter that said he witnessed the so-called suicide and he had actually seen someone throw her over the bridge. Other people felt Cheryl's death was a message, part of some broader conspiracy. Other people wondered if she'd been diagnosed with a serious illness and chose to simply end her life. Back in 2021, when I wrote a story for Jalopnik about Cheryl, I received several emails from people who said that they knew her personally, that they had the real story, and reiterated to me that she was murdered. If you look in the comments section of many other contemporary stories about Cheryl, you'll find similar sentiments. Cheryl Glass was cremated. Her funeral was held on July 22nd, 1977 at Mount Zion Baptist Church. She was 35 years old. Anytime someone talks about a race car driver from the perspective of race or gender, there's usually quite a bit of pushback from people who want to know why they should have to care. They'll find any opportunity to denigrate these drivers, claiming we shouldn't care just because someone was black, or because they were a woman, or because they were somehow different than the norm for racing drivers. We're told that we should care exclusively about talent and nothing else. This has always felt like such a narrow-minded interpretation of the world to me. Motorsport is full of exceptional stories and difficult lessons if only you're willing to scratch below the surface. Of course, we should celebrate our world champions and our race winners, but that celebration shouldn't come at the expense of the thousands of other drivers who contributed to the growth of the sport in some way. Cheryl Glass may not have been a world champion or an Indy 500 winner or even an entrant, but that doesn't make her story less important. For years, she broke barriers just about any time she entered a race, and she had undeniable talent. Her race, her gender, and her family money should not be any reason for us to push her legacy aside, nor should the confusing and upsetting nature of her final years. I think we tend to get so caught up in tragedy and scandal and mystery that we've passed over one big element of Cheryl Glass's story. She suffered massive amounts of head trauma all throughout her career. We now know how dangerous it can be to take repeated blows to the head, which can lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. We're only just starting to study the impacts of CTE on the brains of young athletes. We can't diagnose Cheryl Glass without any physical evidence, but it is very clear that as she grew older, she endured many of the symptoms we now associate with CTE. Mood swings, chronic headaches, aggressive behavior, memory loss, suicidal thoughts, physical motor difficulties, and paranoia. Scientists knew about CTE as early as 1928, but we really didn't begin to understand its impact until research efforts ramped up in 2005, when Dr. Bennett Amalu published the first evidence of CTE in American football player Mike Webster. Today, researchers have studied the brains of over 1,300 athletes and veterans, but that's still a very small sample size, and we still don't know much about the disease. Back in Glass's day, we knew almost nothing. The biggest thing we've learned about CTE in recent years is that you don't need to suffer a bunch of massive concussions to be diagnosed with it. Athletes with CTE generally suffered a lot of head impacts. Some that resulted in concussions, yes, but most were seemingly minor. The frequency of those impacts is just as problematic as the intensity. The more the athletes jostle their brains and their skulls, the more likely a CTE diagnosis becomes. Cheryl Glass's story can be a very difficult one to tackle with understanding and grace. I think white Eurocentric society has a very hard time celebrating the accomplishments of minorities if those minorities weren't perfect. And Cheryl Glass is the epitome of imperfection. She was a fast, talented, and motivated racer, but she was not a dominant one. She had the kind of financial support that most drivers could only dream of, but she didn't seem to have the patience to really stick it out in one discipline where she could nurture her talent. Cheryl Glass felt like she had to be spectacular, and it came at the cost of her performance. Then, as she grew older and much more headstrong and more difficult to work with, she couldn't put together an on-track performance to match the hype that surrounded her presence. Her life after her racing career adds a further layer of confusion and complexity. Her fights with her neighbors, her run-ins with police, her financial difficulties, her paranoia, and the very painful circumstances and interpretations of her death have largely placed Glass outside the realm of motorsport history that fans want to remember. We have a tendency to want our minority heroes to be perfect, and as we mentioned, Glass was far from that. But if our minority heroes can't be perfect, then we want them to be a martyr or a victim, and it's hard to say that Cheryl Glass was that either, even though many people in her life do say that was the case. We can't assign her a simple stereotype, and that makes it difficult for people to reckon with her story. For that reason alone, many motorsport fans would rather ignore Cheryl Glass than try to understand her. At most, many have called her crazy and simply moved on. I think that's why we don't hear about her as much anymore. She's not a person we can easily categorize. She was messy in a way that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But it is such a shame that we choose not to engage with the things that challenge our perceptions, because Cheryl Glass's story is still so important, even if she didn't go on to become the most exceptional racer in history. She was the first woman of color to race at so many tracks. She's a cautionary tale of what can happen if you push yourself too hard and have expectations of yourself that are too high to be reasonably accomplished. She's a reminder that success is built on the repeated mastery of your medium, not by slinging yourself further up the ladder before you're ready. She is, at the end of the day, a human, one who tried her damnedest and who ultimately fell short. And that is what makes her story such an important one. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. In the next one, we're digging into the post-war battle between American sanctioning bodies that very nearly killed racing in the United States. And we'll talk about the tragedy that brought that fight to a close. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. And if you're hungry for more, make sure to subscribe to the DPTJ Patreon. Tiered patrons get exclusive access to weekly blog posts, newsletters, and full-length interviews that I don't share anywhere else. Plus, if you want to send an email, there's an address for that. deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Thank you so much to everyone who has left reviews or comments on the show, particularly everyone who has offered feedback. I'm a writer by trade, which means figuring out the nuance of the audiovisual realm is still a little bit of a challenge, so that advice and expertise helps immensely to make every episode better than the last. And don't forget to check out Homefield Apparel. As we get closer to Indy 500 season, Homefield is releasing incredible open-wheel themed pieces of merch that you are not going to want to miss. Make sure to check out the link in my bio to sign up for updates, and don't forget to use code DPTJ15 for 15% off your first purchase. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn at Spa-Francorchamps, but that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to be able to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each show. You can also find my full list of sources in the episode description. I've been doing research on Cheryl Glass for years, so I have built up a stacked array of article clippings from newspapers.com. I've linked all of them below, as well as to a story of my own that I wrote in Jalopnik back in 2021, and a story that Marshall Pruitt wrote for Road and Track in 2017. But I have to give a very big shout out to Bill Poehler, who released this year a book on Cheryl Glass's life titled The First Lady of Dirt, The Triumphs and Tragedies of Racing Pioneer Cheryl Glass. It's a comprehensive recounting of Cheryl's life, filled with quotes and interviews from her family and many of her competitors. I really recommend it to anyone who wants to know more. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, and I'll see you next time.